Now,
I'd like to welcome.
We're not there yet, sorry. I'll tell you, sorry. Now, okay, we're there, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, I'd like to welcome.
We're not there yet, sorry. I'll tell you,
Getting
sorry.
an echo.
Go ahead.
I'd like to welcome all members of the community of pure reason around the globe to this book session of the Society for Systematic Philosophy. Today, we're going to be hearing two young thinkers addressing the most recent book of Nahum Brown, dealing with the categories that Hegel discusses in his Science of Logic in this section entitled Actuality. In 2018, he published another book which addresses similar territory, which is entitled Hegel's Actuality Chapter of the Science of Logic, a commentary, published in 2018 by Lexington Books. But then in 2020, Bloomsbury came out with this volume, a more, let's say, recent and maybe more consummate treatment entitled Hegel on Possibility, Dialectics, Contradiction, and Modality. And that is the work that is going to be discussed by two speakers in succession. Nahum Brown will respond to each after each of their presentations. And we're going to begin with Ryan Froese. So I'm going to hand over the Zoom meeting from Athens, Georgia to Chicago. I just mentioned that Ryan Froese is working on a PhD at DePaul University, and it is a dissertation focusing on modality and the method of Hegel's Science of Logic. So I look forward to hearing what Ryan will have to say about Nahum's work. So Ryan, why don't you take it away?
Thanks very much, Richard. Thank you, Gregory, for organizing, and thanks especially to Nahum for this opportunity, this invitation. I'm really excited for the discussion today and really grateful just to have been able to begin work on this book of yours that Richard was talking about. I guess about a year ago, I was reading it and working through it. So I'm gonna offer a presentation, of course, on it. There will be a bit of summary and then a line of questions that I have about the work. I'll read it, so I hope that's okay. And I hope my audio is fine. I have a fan on in the background, but if that's not a problem, then I'll go. Okay. So since Dieter Henrich's 1959 essay, Hegel's Theorie über den Zufall, commentators have used the Actuality chapter in the Science of Logic to show that Hegel believes in the necessity of contingency. Rather than seeing Hegel as a strict necessitarian who expels contingency from his system, it is now fairly well accepted that Hegel believes that contingency is neither irrational nor illusory. Nahum Brown's Hegel on Possibility, Dialectics, Contradiction, and Modality follows this tradition of showing that Hegel does not deny the existence of contingency, but instead of focusing primarily on necessity and contingency, Brown, of course, investigates the role of another modal category, possibility. For this reason alone, this emphasis on possibility, it is a fresh approach and addition to the existing literature on Hegel's theory of modality. Brown's text is so rich, not only in offering a provocative view of Hegel's account of possibility, but showing why it is central to other crucial portions of the logic, namely, and especially the logic's beginning and its section on contradiction. And not just the section on contradiction, but the role of contradiction that plays throughout the logic and Hegel's system. Brown's contention is that we can learn crucial things about the nature of possibility from the lessons of these other sections. We can see, for example, Hegel's notion of totality in the movement from being to nothing and the primacy of contradiction over identity in the latter section. His reading of these passages is extremely careful, lucid, and original. A somewhat minor example of this is given when he notes that the most popular readings of Hegel's account of modality leave us with the view that contingency is a necessary category along with every other category in the logic. But this book is a testament that such readings, in trying to emphasize the role of contingency and possibility in Hegel's system, do not take their own aims far enough, since they ultimately still allow possibility and contingency to be subsumed by necessity and actuality. Brown, on the other hand, both offers a compelling reading for how possibility can and should be emphasized in any reading of Hegel, and then sees the implications of such a reading all the way through. It is in this reading of possibility that Brown sees resources to respond to the problem of what he calls modal indeterminacy. This problem results from trying to adequately explain one of our most basic assumptions, which is the belief that unactualized possibilities exist. Although most would likely agree that there are unactualized possibilities, how to make precise sense of the ontological status of these possibilities is a much more controversial matter. Brown identifies two ways of responding to this problem. The first way is to adopt a view of modal priority, where actuality stands higher than possibility. On this view, actuality is prioritized above possibility because possibility now exists for the sake of actuality. Possibility on its own is deficient, requiring actuality for its completion. The second route comprises various approaches to world separation, all of which assert that possibilities, unactual possibilities, do exist, but in a world or worlds beyond this one. By contrast, Hegel represents a third approach, a view that, on Brown's reading, neither prioritizes actuality over possibility, nor posits that there are multiple or any worlds beyond this one. Instead, according to Brown, Hegel propels his argument about the nature of possibility forward through two conceptions of possibility: possibility as alternatives and possibility as a degree of quantity. These conceptions of possibility are what ground Brown's thesis of modal optimism, which is, quote, the theory that this actual world contains infinite sets of infinite possibilities within it. Part one of the book sets up Brown's later conceptions of possibility by gleaning some lessons from two crucial sections within the logic that appear before the actuality chapter. As already mentioned, the first of these is the beginning of the logic and the movement from being to nothing to becoming. Brown's point here is that at the core of Hegel's logic is an emphasis on totality as negation and exhaustion. Already at the beginning of this text, Brown contends being exhausts all of its permutations, since it proves to be absolutely everything, including its own negation. Brown's aim is to support the eventual argument, which is made in the second half of the book, that there are, quote, infinite varieties of unactualized possibility within this actual world, end quote. Since being, it proves itself simply to be nothing. Its own unity with its negation shows that Hegel's view of totality is deeply inclusive. Hegel's understanding of totality is thus not restrictive, but it contains everything that is and the negation of all that is. This line of argumentation leads into the following chapter, which turns to Hegel's account of contradiction in the Doctrine of Essence. As Brown shows, Hegel sees contradiction as productive. This will serve Brown's later claims about actuality containing both the possibility of something to be, along with the possibility that it can not be. The second half of the book outlines Brown's thesis for modal optimism. Modal optimism gives us an account of the ontological status of unactual possibility, while also avoiding the prioritization of actuality or any multiple worlds theory. Brown contrasts Hegel's position with Leibniz and Deleuze primarily, specifically in terms of Leibniz's notion of incompossibility. In the final chapter, Brown takes up two objections to his work concerning determinism and radical transformation. As is evident from this very brief outline, the scope of this project is remarkable, not only in its inclusion of so many crucial parts of the logic, but in the way in which Brown seamlessly integrates countless other thinkers from the history of philosophy to show how unique and incisive Hegel's conception of possibility is. So my line of questions will focus on Brown's reading of Hegel's Actuality chapter. As already mentioned, Brown draws out two conceptions of possibility stemming from this section of the logic inside or as a part of the Doctrine of Essence. The first of these is possibility as alternatives. Brown explains that possibility as alternatives is simply Hegel's insight taken from the section on formal modality, that any actualized possibility excludes its contraries. Formal possibility first assumes that anything that is not self-contradictory is possible, and that its contrary is also possible. That is, if A meets the demand of the principle of non-contradiction, then A and not A are possible. To take one of Brown's examples, since it is possible for a pianist to play the piano, it is also possible for them not to play. However, these alternatives do not both remain possible once one side of the pair is actualized. That is, although both A and not A are possible before either is actualized, once one is actualized, the other becomes impossible. If the pianist is playing the piano, it is in fact impossible for them also not to be playing. Thus, actuality precludes certain possibilities, even ones that are not contradictory, that is, formally possible. As Brown says, this aligns with our ordinary assumptions about possibility, and Hegel's main purpose is to criticize, or at least develop, this conception of possibility. However, as I will go into more detail below, at times it seems to me that Brown both recognizes these limitations and criticisms, but also wants to endorse a kind of possibility that remains at the level of formal possibility. Indeed, in some ways, this is what the project might call for, since what we are trying to understand is the status of unactualized possibility. Although it is true that there are resources to say that we can still talk about unactualized possibility once we move on to real modality, Brown's claim that there are infinite possibilities within this world would seem to suggest that we must say that some of these infinite possibilities are merely formal. But Hegel's point is arguably a bit more critical, saying that some unactual possibilities, because they are merely formal and because their set of real conditions will never obtain, are not really possibilities at all. I will say more about this below, but first let me just talk about conditionality and the second kind of possibility that Brown develops. Possibility as alternatives leads into Brown's second conception of possibility, possibility as a degree of quantity. Brown now notices that for Hegel, it is actuality itself that serves as the condition for further actualities. Under this model, actual conditions serve as the basis for what is possible. On Hegel's view, possibility is no longer a mere abstraction constrained only by the principle of non-contradiction or merely what is thinkable, but is already a part of actuality, since anything actual can serve as a condition for another actuality, and thus is what makes something possible or not. The possibility of a tree depends not simply on whether or not it is inherently contradictory to be a tree, but whether or not we have the real conditions met of there being a seed, water, sunlight, soil, and so forth. What makes the tree possible then are other actualities which serve as conditions for the actuality that is the tree. But Brown thinks that this conditionality brings a second characteristic along with it. For him, this conditionality gives us degrees of possibility, meaning that something can be more or less possible, or that actuality contains within it varying degrees of possibility. I take Brown to mean that possibilities are not all equal, since because they are determined by conditions, actuality has greater and lesser possibilities. Possibilities, as he puts it, can expand and contract. And so the actualization of one possibility, for example, moving to a new city, can open up new possibilities while also negating other ones. This unites actuality and possibility more strongly than possibility as alternatives, since now actuality does not merely negate contrary possibilities, but rather contains a vast array of possibilities within itself. So these two conceptions of possibility seem to be drawn primarily from Hegel's insights on formal and real modality, the first two stages of this section of the logic. That is, we can get a conception of possibility as alternatives solely from formal modality, and possibility as a degree of quantity can be drawn from the conditionality that defines real modality. Now, I want to be sure to mention that Brown does have a detailed reading of Hegel's account of the third moment of modality, namely absolute modality or absolute necessity, but it is not obvious to me how exactly absolute modality fits into these two conceptions of possibility, or to what degree they are dependent upon absolute possibility, if at all. For me, at least, and I would love to be corrected on this, it seems like both of these conceptions of possibility can be gained without considering what Hegel says about absolute modality. I am especially curious how exactly absolute modality would overcome some of the indeterminacies that Hegel sees as inherent in both formal and real modality. This is worth mentioning simply because in a project that seeks to overcome a kind of modal indeterminacy, on my reading at least, Brown situates his various conceptions of possibility among the sorts of possibility that Hegel seems to think are the most indeterminate and underdeveloped. Hegel writes that once we have a set of conditions, something necessarily becomes actualized. As noted, these conditions themselves are actualities, and thus we have actuality conditioning actuality. This means that an actualized set of conditions will necessarily lead to the resulting actuality which they condition, but also that this result is contingent upon this set of conditions. For this reason, Hegel makes two claims about how closely related the modal categories have become. The indeterminacy at the core of real modality is that anything that is necessary through a set of conditions is also contingent, since had these conditions not have been, it also would not be. What makes something possible is the realization of its conditions, which then give rise to it necessarily. So Hegel then says that, quote, real possibility and necessity are only seemingly different, end quote. Moreover, real necessity is identified with contingency since it is nothing other than the contingent set of conditions that give rise to this real actuality. He says, real necessity is in itself also contingency. Now, if real necessity is hardly indistinguishable from real possibility and contingency, it seems like this will support Brown's thesis for modal optimism, since possibility is not being extinguished by either necessity or actuality, as it was in the model of possibility as alternatives. Nor is it going to be dominated in some sort of hierarchical relationship with actuality. So it is not just that possibility is no longer subservient to actuality and necessity. It seems that it is possibility as conditionality that determines the necessary and the actual. It is the seed as the condition of the tree that determines whether the tree will become actual. However, the problem as I see it is that this indeterminacy can just as easily swing the other way. What real modality gives us is just a chain of external conditionality, where everything is determined by something, its set of conditions outside of itself. Possibility may be what conditions actuality, but it can be nothing more than what is given, and the givenness of possibility results in a logic of relativity. Of course, we can still say that if the conditions were otherwise, then a different possibility would obtain. In this way, we can posit unactualized possibilities. But real modality also points us to the sober reality that only certain possibilities have been obtained, and that these have already blocked other determinate possibilities. Now, Brown notes this dynamic throughout, that actual possibilities will block other possibilities, but I'm still not sure how we can be left with a picture of infinite possibilities in any meaningful sense. Either actual conditions preclude some possibilities in the infinite set, or they do not. Although Brown says that modal optimism celebrates possibility, it is not clear to me how a logic of conditionality gets us a true possibility. Brown writes, quote, complex varieties of possibility stand latent under the surface of this actual world and are imminently traversable through conditions, end quote. While it is true that possibilities are realized by conditions, it is unclear why conditionality gets us close to something like his thesis for modal optimism, which, remember, argues for the existence of infinite possibilities. Indeed, possibility as conditionality seems to be not all that different from the first conception of possibility above. That is, it is now the conditions that are actual, which both determine what is possible and negate the possibility of contraries. So long as the conditions for the plant's life are in place, the plant will not die. The indeterminacy that I see here harkens back to what Hegel says about contingency in its introduction in the Actuality chapter. Contingency, he writes, is both groundless and grounded. It has no reason for being, and yet it also has some reason, some ground for why it is. The same is still at work, I take it, to some degree at least, in real modality. Conditions necessitate some actuality, but we can just as easily assume that these conditions are themselves contingent, and thus what looks to be necessary is in fact contingent. By the same logic, what looks to be possible is still determined by actuality, a conclusion that Brown is surely trying to avoid. Although conditions can rightly be called possibilities, and this is exactly what Hegel refers to them as, it is hard to locate where the optimism in this picture lies for me, or how this gets us to a set of infinite possibilities, as his thesis for modal optimism argues for. As I mentioned earlier, it seems that if Brown both relies on the logic of conditionality and wants to say that possibility lies latent in conditions, then his modal optimism in some ways may still be tied to formal possibility. Whereas real possibility for Hegel is already an actual condition, formal possibility can both exist in some sense and be non-actual. That is, we can say something is formally possible and say nothing of whether it actually exists or not. It seems very difficult to have this structure in either real or absolute modality. In real modality, something is really possible when its conditions are in place. And with absolute modality, Hegel writes that we have, quote, actuality that can no longer be otherwise, end quote. Now, I am entirely convinced by Brown's claim that absolute necessity does not extinguish contingency. But his claim that because of it being the unity of actuality and possibility, quote, being must go in every possible way, end quote, is difficult for me to grasp and returns me to my worry that this sounds much more like formal possibility rather than absolute possibility. Of course, Brown is well aware and mentions throughout Hegel's criticisms of formal possibility. Here are some of these criticisms of Hegel. In the Encyclopedia, when he's writing on the abstract form of possibility, he writes, in philosophy, there should be no talk of this demonstration, that something is possible or that something else is also possible, and that something, as people also say, is thinkable. More strongly, he goes on to say, there is no emptier talk than of this kind of possibility and impossibility. And in the greater logic, Hegel writes that, quote, this purely formal expression, it is possible, is as shallow and empty as the principle of non-contradiction, end quote. Hegel notes in the Zusatz to paragraph 143 in the Encyclopedia that we can say that even the most absurd events, like the moon falling to the earth or the Sultan becoming Pope, are possible in terms of formal possibility. I bring these examples up because Brown cites them in his discussion of formal possibility, although we seem to have different readings about what Hegel is saying about these examples. In Brown's discussion of this passage, he notes that Hegel is pointing to the absurdity of believing that these sorts of events, the moon falling to the earth or the Sultan becoming Pope, are not only possible, but necessary. Brown writes, quote, these suppositions become absurd, however, when we associate them with necessity, end quote. However, Hegel does not discuss necessity at all in this passage, and necessity as a category is only introduced 4 paragraphs later. On my reading, Hegel's contention here is not that formal possibility becomes absurd if we believe these sorts of possibilities will necessarily be actualized. Instead, his point is that this, or these sorts and other abstract possibilities are already absurd simply as possibilities. And much more importantly, that they are not even really possibilities at all. This is why he says formal possibility is just as much impossibility. We can imagine the moon falling to the earth or the Sultan becoming Pope because they are not inherently contradictory. But they are not really possible since the real conditions that would have to be in place for these events to occur do not exist. And so we cannot even properly say, on Hegel's view, at least on how I read him, that it is truly possible for these events to occur. They are thinkable, but not really possible. But for me, if I consider the radical modal optimism that Brown endorses, then I must retain this view of possibility if I am to reach the conclusion that there are infinite possibilities that exist in the world, but that will not all become actual. Now, I want to reiterate that Brown is more than familiar with Hegel's worries about formal modality, and there is no way in which Brown thinks that his own account of modal optimism is merely a rehashing of formal possibility. But examples like the following make it difficult for me to see why some sort of reverting back to a merely formal possibility is not sometimes at work. So here's a bit of a longer quote, and then I'll conclude. Quote, all possibilities necessarily exist, but not all possibilities are necessarily actual. Most lie dormant under the surface of what is immediately actual. Most remain embedded in conditions and require necessity to bring about possibilities that are otherwise inaccessible and only distantly foreseeable. Based on this model, unicorns, monsters, and worlds where gravity goes up, all must exist. but their mere existence does not necessitate their actualization, end quote. On the one hand, it seems the mere mention of conditions gets us past mere formal possibility and this worry of mine. But on the other hand, I'm not sure that Hegel is saying that unicorns exist in any sense other than that they're formally possible. I do not know how to understand Brown's position other than to say that unicorns are possible and that this possibility exists only because they are not inherently contradictory. That is, unicorns exist because they do not violate the principle of non-contradiction. Of course, Brown says in this passage that he does not think unicorns can or will be actual, but I am unsure why he relies on Hegel for this view, since out of everything Hegel says about modality, it is surely this conception that Hegel is most critical of, since this seems to be nothing more than the merely thinkable. These concerns of mine are obviously extremely narrow, but that should only be a testament to how convincing this project is as a whole for me. Brown's work will surely be, and already has been, an indispensable addition to the growing literature on Hegel, modality, and the science of logic as a whole. We should not let my limited remarks cover over the fact that Brown discusses not only Hegel, Leibniz, and Deleuze, but then also draws throughout the book from thinkers from practically every significant period of Western philosophy. The scope of this work is truly astonishing, to say nothing of the inviting style in which Brown writes. Anyone who wishes to work through the nuances of Hegel's account of modality in the logic, or anyone who wishes to learn more about the nature of possibility in general, will have to go through this text. Although it makes a case for infinite possibility, I hope Nahum will forgive me for saying that the work is absolutely necessary. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. I'd now like to ask Nahum to respond, and then we can take a 5-minute break before we move to the latter half of the session. Nahum, go ahead.
Thanks. Ryan, thank you. I'm really grateful that you've written this review, and it's a real pleasure to meet you. And I think the review is really interesting, and the criticisms are interesting and really worth working through. And I'm just realizing that, if I understand correctly, you're working on modality in the science of logic as part of your PhD, right? I see. Okay. I hadn't quite realized that. Like, we have a friend in common, Jacob Singer, who's put us in touch over a year ago. And I didn't fully understand, like, to what extent you're working on the project, that sort of thing. So that's a revelation to me. And that also helps me think through what to say to you. I figure that you'd like me to address some of the questions and the criticisms. I'm actually going to start, though, by talking about some strategies for how to do the commentary. And I think if you do develop the commentary, the explication of the book, the argument of the book, a little bit more in a slightly different way, some of the questions that you have might be more answerable. And then I think also the larger criticism that I think you're drawing up, which in a way I see as a potentially a viable reading of the Actuality chapter, which would be in some conflict with my own. I think that reading might, the sort of the criticism of that reading might have more force to it. So I think that the beginning of your presentation is pretty effective, and you pretty clearly outline the overview of the book, the chapters of the book, and whatnot. I want to just draw us to, I have it printed out here at page 2. At the bottom of 2, you say there's kind of a transition here between when you're talking about the overview of the book, and then you say at the bottom of 2, my line of questions will focus on Brown's reading of Hegel's Actuality chapter. Right, so there you're really kind of, as you say in the last paragraph, there's a kind of a narrower point that you're going to work from, and some of that narrowness is going to have to do with focusing on the actuality chapter specifically. It's not that narrow, since that also is probably the most important part of the book. So then you go on, and this is where I want to just sort of point out something. You go on to talk about possibility as alternatives and possibility as a degree of quantity. I wasn't expecting that after the sentence where you say that you're going to focus on my reading of the actuality chapter. And I realize now, like, you're really helping me to see how people are going to read this book. I realize that I made I guess I would say small or medium mistake in putting that distinction so prominently in the introduction. It appears for about 3 pages or so in the introduction, but actually, let me just sort of explain my internal thought process as I was writing the book. That distinction is born out of chapter 5, and it's specifically there. Like, it helps me to establish a reconstruction of what I think Hegel's response to Leibniz would be about the incompossibility problem in chapter 5. So that's where that distinction is, that's the source of that distinction. And then one of the last decisions I made in writing this book, I felt that I needed to find a clear and sort of exciting way to summarize the trajectory of the argument of the book. And I was really struggling with how to do that well. I wanted it to be like a hook, you know, to catch people who might not love Hegel, might not know Hegel that well, or might, you know, I wanted to sort of excite them. And so I thought, oh, this point I'm making in chapter 5, I really like this point. I think this is one of the more interesting things I make. I'm going to extract it and re-summarize it in the introduction. And what I didn't realize is that by extracting it out of the context of the discussion with Leibniz, I'm not really giving full resources for you to work through absolute modality. And that's so that's one thing I realized in what you're saying. I think it would be a much better strategy, and it's really my own misleading here. I think it would be a much better strategy if you were to focus the explication after page 2 on chapter 3. And that's conspicuously missing from your discussion. You basically don't touch chapter 3. And in chapter 3, there are a lot of concepts, and there's really a detailed set of steps of an argument that I present, which I think the commentary would be more effective if you trace that argument, the steps and the concepts there, in the terms that I've set them up. You may not agree with them ultimately, because I do see that you have a really different reading going, but I'd feel happier as the author if I felt like we're really thinking together, and I'm seeing my thought expressed, you know, in the explication part of the review more. And it's my own fault for suggesting, by placing that distinction in the introduction, that you could really do everything with that. And so some of the concepts that I think are missing, and some of the argument that I think is missing, is the idea that possibility has these two sides formally, that something can be and cannot be, and that there's a fundamental contradiction right away in the chapter. That actuality is supposed to be the actuality of possibility, but actuality cannot actualize the possible itself. And so there's a breakdown right away. Actualization fails in a formal sense to express possibility. I also, since I finished the book, I realized that there's another point I wanted to make in the book, which is that the argument for why Hegel thinks that actuality as a concept needs to encompass possibility comes from an earlier argument he makes throughout the Doctrine of Essence, which he summarizes in the catchphrase, essence must appear. So the reading I try to give of the Actuality chapter, which comes up in chapter 3, is that there is this fundamental contradiction, which is super productive for Hegel, where actualization is unable to fully embrace those sides of possibility, specifically because possibility has the negativity of the actual in it. And then from there, the way that I've read it is that the modal structure goes through all sorts of developments of conceptions of actuality and possibility, which express the possible itself better. And so we get formal contingency as the next step in the way that I present it, where we have an actual, just this, which also has an expression in it of its opposite, what could have been. And so there we have a slightly better rendering of an actual, which is the totality of the counterfactual as well, right? And and then I go on into the conditional actualization, the real modality section, and the specific point about conditions then, which you talk about conditions, but not exactly in the way that I had hoped you would. Conditions, as far as I see it, are an actual, which is at the same time, in a slightly different sense, the possible of others. And then there's a whole process there, and that's another way in which the actual approaches, an actualization approaches the negation. There's a way in which we're undermining contradiction here. And that, that's the point I tried to set up in chapter 2. So anyway, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think that if you shift your strategy a little bit about what you're doing after page 2 for, a page or two there, and focus on chapter 3, we'd be more lined up in terms of the thinking for a moment. I think you'd be more fairly presenting the argument that I'm attempting to give. And I do think then you really have a very interesting way of reading the chapter. And I think, if I could say, maybe this will help you, maybe the conflict for us is that I'm reading Hegel as extremely inclusive. And it sounds to me like you're saying, maybe Hegel isn't that inclusive. Isn't he saying that there are unicorns, there are things that we think which are merely possible, which cannot come up in actuality? And you might be right, maybe I've misunderstood this, but the way that I've tried to present it is that the unicorn, in a direct sense, doesn't exist. And yet, if the conditions were to come into play in just that right way, they could exist. And then also, I just want to make one more point, and this might help you to approach the absolute section, because I do feel that I have written a lot about that section. In a way, that's like one of the big aims of the books and one of the big difficulties of the books. It's so hard to interpret that section of the chapter. So many people have struggled with it. I'm also struggling. I see some tentativeness from you in the review. And you're absolutely right that from the distinction between possibility as alternatives and possibility as a degree of quantity, when it's extracted from chapter 5, it's hard to get there. But the key word, which is missing entirely from the review, and I think it would be good to include it, is substance. In the third section of the chapter, Hegel's giving us a modality of substance. And that's a very different way of thinking about the inclusion of the possible in the actual. It's a very different way of thinking about an actualization. There we finally have the full transition between actuality and possibility. We have an actualization that fully expresses the negativity and the positivity of the possible. right? And so that's what I was trying to get at. And then from there, I realize the second part is controversial, and you've drawn out some sentences which maybe sound a little bit esoteric and whatnot. But from the terms of substance, and then thinking of being as the one substance, going like Hegel's talking to Spinoza and Leibniz here, right? And so we're trying to think of this as all. And so, that's how I get to the idea that we're involved with infinite possibilities. And I mean, they don't obviously exist in a literal sense, from that initial contradiction. There is certainly disjunction, which is still in play in so many ways. But, when we think in terms of substance, the position I'm trying to present is that we have to think total inclusion in terms of the negation of the possible. And so those unicorns exist. The negation of what exists and exists in a way as an expanded version of actuality. So one other point I would make is that in chapter 3, I talk a lot about the expanding of actuality. And, so there's a kind of a metaphor there, and maybe I'm being overly interpretive with the chapter and it's not fully there, I don't know. But it would be good if you maybe go through that and show to the reader that this is part of my thinking. Whether it's right or not is another matter. So ultimately, I'm just making a small point that the piece would, I think, be more effective, and your contribution, which I think is excellent. And I mean, you've gone like really far in, you're doing more than just a book review here. And I have this revelation that, oh, you're working on the chapter. I remember when I was working on the chapter, as a graduate student, I had all of the, started to have all of these ideas. And in some ways, it also was a little bit harder for me then to approach Holgate and Burbage and other people who were talking about it, because I had sort of something at stake already. And so I guess, I don't mean to be too harsh with this, but it would be more effective if for a moment you do that exercise where you really turn to the argument in my terms. And then do that contrast.
Do we have time for?
Ryan, would you want to briefly respond?
Sure. Yeah. I know briefly. I know we want, just cut me off. So Nahum, yeah, thank you very much for that. It was extremely helpful, but also very generous response. The first thing I'll say is, I disagree that this has anything to do with the fault of your own. I think your book is extremely lucid and clear, and the faults in me misrepresenting your argument lie only with me and not how the introduction was organized or anything like that. So I don't have any pushback in terms of how to change this review. And so I think I agree that there are problems with the way I organize it, especially in trying to attach too closely these two conceptions of possibility that have more to do with chapter 5 and less to do with chapter 3. So I take that criticism, and I thank you for it. I would, if I can ask a question about chapter 3. I am very interested in inclusiveness that you brought up in your response now, right? And I think you're right. I think there's a different reading we have on how inclusive, or what it means for Hegel to be inclusive, right? And so, and I guess my further question is that it seems to me in your reading of the Actuality chapter and of your reading of absolute modality in chapter 3, that there are points where you still do seem to accept that there are limits to possibility. And so, so your example, for example, when you're talking, and I forgot to mention, I totally agree with you that I didn't, first of all, I should have just outlined your detailed example and not just said you talk about absolute necessity. I should have talked about what you said about it. But I totally agree that I should have brought up your discussion of substance and also essence, right? And the unity of essence and existence that is accomplished with absolute modality. And as I remember one of your examples, you talk about the possibility of a goat, right? But you say things in the section on absolute modality, you say things like, the goat does have infinite possibilities, but there are these limits. The goat cannot not be a goat, right? And the goat has the possibility of walking in every direction, right? But it cannot actually walk in every direction. Once it goes to the left, it can't go to the right. Once it goes to the barn, it's not going to go to the meadow, right? And that's where I think we agree. And that's also the line of my unclear questions in the review, where that seems to me, and again, I'm deferring, you're the expert. I know you've worked on this much longer than I have, even though I am trying to understand the same section. Those characteristics of possibility seem to me more to do with formal and real modality, right? Because there we do have, either I can go in one direction or I can't, either I can be, I cannot not be a human or something like that, if I'm stretching the goat example to myself, right? And so, but I know there's more to it. Like I know that's not just what you're not, there has to be more than just this repetition of formal and real modality or something like that. Or so I guess to summarize, that's where I do see us agreeing that there are limits and that possibility is determinate, right? So I do read Hegel as saying things become limited and determinate in some sense, right? And so I think we can say there's a kind of inclusion in Hegel, and your reading of the opening of the logic, I would agree, right? Being becoming nothing seems to be pretty expansive and comprehensive. But things along the way seem to get more determinate and limited in some sense. So that was a lot, but I'm just curious on how you talk through like how you see inclusion and possibility in your reading of absolute modality.
Richard, could I just do a 1-minute response?
Sure, go ahead.
Time?
Yeah, and then we'll take over.
Thanks, Ryan. That's a great question. It's really interesting, and you're getting to the heart of the matter there. At the end of chapter 1, I talk about the good infinite. And so there you have, it might be worth looking at that again. That might help to answer the question of how is limitation still at play in the modals, in the absolute section. Without any limitation at all, as kind of a bad infinite, we could say, we have modal indeterminacy. Hegel's doesn't advocate for modal indeterminacy. And so there are still limitations in play in terms of this inclusiveness. And, so like the good infinite is an infinite that's also including the limitation of being finite, right? And yet also, and that's how it's completed the infinite. And so I'm very much trying to think through the good infinite, think about the good infinite in modal terms in the absolute modality section. So maybe that would help you with that. I do think we are, lined up more there. I'm trying to make it's a sort of a difficult point, which is that these determinations and limitations, and this is also not existing, are the way that we are able to reach a full totality of the possible and the actual.
Okay, why don't we stop at this point for a 5-minute recess, and then we'll resume, and Aiken Erkan will give his response to Nahum Brown's book. Okay, see you all back in 5 minutes.
Once we're all back, I will resume recording.
Okay.
Okay, looks like we're all back. So let me go ahead and resume recording. Just 1 second. Once we're all back, I will resume recording.
Okay. Okay, I would like to welcome everyone back to the second part of our book session on Nahum Brown's Hegel on Possibility. And now we're going to hear from Ekin Erkan, who is a Turkish philosopher based in New York, concentrating on philosophy of mind and cognitive science alongside Kant and post-Kantian German idealism, specifically Hegel. He is based at the CUNY Graduate Center, and his work has been published in many journals. So, Ekin, why don't you begin?
First of all, thank you so much. Thank you, Gregory, Nahum, especially for the invitation. It's an absolute honor to be amongst such luminaries in Hegel scholarship. So thank you genuinely from the bottom of my heart for this opportunity. So this is a review that I've expanded on. I've published it in PLI Warwick Journal of Philosophy, and there will be some situating of the book within contemporary Hegel interpretation and some specific queries that perhaps will extend beyond just the response that Nahum will provide within the general discussion section. So as is well known, there's burgeoned a notable dominant strand of Hegel scholarship over the last few decades. Some we can call textualists, and they unerringly work at excising Hegel's intent. Then there's more epistemological readings that some say are spearheaded now by an Anglo-American Pittsburgh School left Salarzian tradition. Then there's others who read Hegel's system as an idealist successor framework to Kant's transcendental logic. There's those who see apperception as a guiding concept that Hegel inherits from Kant. And there's others who find specific concepts like Hegel's concept of life as a continuation of Kant's conception of internal purposiveness from the Third Critique. And a lot of ink has been spilled over who offers a genuinely metaphysical approach. And in doing so, to take Hegel to be reviving some pre-Kantian idea that conceptual structures have a mind-independent status as a substantial form of actuality that therein cannot be reduced to self-conscious activity. And these have been poised against so-called non-metaphysical readings that situate Hegel in the Kantian tradition of investigating the concepts that are necessary for cognition by way of analysis of self-conscious and autonomous thinking activity. I'd say that Brown's Hegel on Possibility finds them closing in on these ranks by unspooling modal logic and its transcendental instantiation via metaphysics qua metaphysics, and therein proffering a metaphysics-first approach that has its quilting point in Hegel's theory of possibility, as it emerges in the logic, and precisely how Hegel deals with contradiction tout court in his mature system especially. Brown's primary interest is in Hegel's solution to the problem of modal indeterminacy, which emerges from the recognition that every possibility cannot be said to exist in actuality without some form of qualification, a conceptual scaffolding of worlds. Thus, I'm going to give a bit of a summary. He begins the book by stating his intent is to analyze Hegel's theory of possibility and the related conception of contradiction by examining Hegel's solution to the problem of what Brown terms modal indeterminacy. This problem comes from the recognition that every possibility cannot be said to exist in actuality without some form of qualification by either distinguishing existence in the concept of actuality from existence in the concept possibility, or by separating the multiplicity of possible outcomes through the conceptual scaffolding of worlds, which involves, quote, separating this actual world from a higher or lower world that transcends it, or by arguing that there are multiple possible worlds that extend beyond this one. Via the logic, the first chapter considers how the concept of possibility inherently contains negativity That is, what is possible both can be and cannot be. And contra those interlocutors who insist upon potentiality as a primary concept, Brown gives us a Hegel from whom possibility refers to formal aspects of modality. Brown also recognizes, however, that Hegel has these two other distinct concepts of possibility, real possibility and absolute possibility. That is, possibilities are not excluded from actuality. They're always and already the moments of actuality. Accordingly, actuality has a twofold structure containing one, immediacy, i.e. actuality as existence, and reflection, non-immediacy, i.e. possibility. Consequently, Brown argues that Hegel's, quote, modal theory is that necessity not only restricts possibility, but also amplifies it, producing endless variations of thought and reality, unquote. Hegel argues that possibility and actuality are transitional concepts, offering a modal theory that navigates indeterminacy as possibility and actuality are brought into a necessary relationship of reconciliation. Unlike his predecessors, the Hegelian school, Atomists, Descartes, Leibniz, Hegel doesn't threaten to reduce modal reality into the abundance of possibility, thus claiming that unactualized possibility does not exist. For Brown, Hegel's theory is fruit-bearing precisely because for Hegel, possibility is already contained in actuality. And unlike David Lewis's modal realism, where the world we are part of is but one of a plurality of worlds, each world being actual to itself and merely possible to all others, such that actuality is relative, what Brown terms Hegel's modal optimism claims that possibility and actuality are transitional concepts. So the actual world contains infinite sets of infinite possibilities within it, and we've heard a bit about this in the prior presentation. So Hegel's modal theory crystallized in the Actuality chapter, where Brown begins his analysis, inaugurating a definition of possibility as the, quote, projection of alternative actualities, unquote. Formally, if something is possible, this expresses both a positive and negative side of something in actuality. If A is possible, then both A and non-A are possible. However, what is actual excludes alternative possibilities from actuality, and this is the true object of Hegel's critique, grounding this theory of modality that includes greater amounts of possibility within one actuality. The first half of the book offers a close and textual interpretive study of Hegel's conception of possibility as it appears in the Essence, situating the primary consequences of dialectical modality within discussions of Hegel's presuppositionless starting point, starting from the introduction, where we see a thesis that contradiction is more primary than identity taking shape. So the first two chapters, Brown analyzes two interrelated uses of contradiction. First, we have contradiction as totality. A is non-A, forms a totality and accordingly is exhaustive. Contradiction conjoins the negative with the positive, such that transcendence collapses into immanence. And with contradiction, there's no exterior to the plurality of positions. Contraditional connotations, Hegel consistently defines totality counterintuitively as a coincidence of being and negativity. So when Hegel claims in the phenomenology that the, quote, true is the whole, unquote, or in the logic that, quote, being and nothing are becoming, unquote, Hegel proffers the modal position that possibility is the totality of form. Here, possibility is not a positive account of itself in actuality, but a negative account of non-actuality. Possibility encompasses the totality of any actualization whatsoever, and more precisely, co-opting the apophatic conception of possibility, A expresses the totality of actualization because it projects both A and non-A. So Hegel's seen as a one-world model that dialectically, as giving us a one-world model that dialectically reincorporates possibilities which appear at first to be excluded from actuality, and this is transitional because all excluded possibilities become subsequent material for future actualizations. The one-world modal theory that Brown gives us contains infinite varieties of other world-like composites, which are not exterior worlds transcending the actual world, but instead immanent parts of the constitution of actuality. That which modal theorists may term alternate possible worlds are for Hegel embedded in the determinate content of the actual world, which contains infinite sets of every possible combination within it, the real existence of absolute possibility. Nonetheless, many of these possibilities are prohibited by absolute necessity, which is equivalent to contingency, i.e. absolute necessity is contingency. But this doesn't mean that unactualized possibilities are inaccessible to thinking. Quite the opposite. While most accounts of modal ontology define necessity and contingency as opposite terms, in the sense that what is necessary cannot be otherwise, but what is contingent can be otherwise, Hegel gives us the thought that necessity brings access to otherwise inaccessible possibilities, and that the foreclosure of absolute necessity is the free openness of absolute contingency. So Brown says, quote, necessity leads to otherwise inaccessible possibility, and the groundbreaking but controversial conclusion that contingency and absolute necessity are dialectically intertwined, unquote. Then how do possibilities come into actuality? For Brown, the answer lies with the inherent restrictions and limitations of determinate being. As Brown notes, quote, being is an indeterminate immediacy that also has to include determinate being as well, unquote. Prior to the transitional concepts of becoming and actuality taking stage is the presuppositionless opening, where we see exactly how Hegel deals with the question of being. Being, with all its dyadic might, makes indeterminacy prior to contradiction and completely inclusive, at once all-comprehensive and presuppositionless. On the one hand, being contains no difference, since to contain difference would mean to generate determinateness and exclusion. On the other hand, being cannot be differentiated from that which does contain difference within it, and this ambiguity imbues Hegel's being with the status of indeterminateness. So we can equally describe being as that which all things indiscriminately are as their most basic qualification, and that which is so full that nothing can exceed it. Being fails to be meaningful since nothing requires distinction and difference. Therefore, due to its pure indeterminacy, being confers nothing, which it always already is. Becoming, rather than mediating being to nothing, is a movement of thought from being to nothing and vice versa. However, here Brown argues that there is a, quote, double meaning of being's relation to nothing, unquote, referencing the semantic ambiguity of the remark that, quote, being has nothing over against it, unquote, which, quote, expresses that on the one hand, the concept negative is the opposite external contrast of being, while simultaneously nothing at all can escape being or be otherwise than being, unquote. So Brown states that Hegel establishes nothing as the opposite of, but also the same as pure being, and via the compound concept becoming, both the derivative and starting point of being and nothing, Hegel changes emphasis from the positive concepts being and nothing to the process of transition between the two. They form totality through negation, where the exhaustion and completion of all determinate possibilities is a result of alterity. This first philosophy conclusion that being is nothing is critical to Brown's thesis, where the transition from being to nothing commits Hegel to a weaker and more ambiguous form of apophaticism without prioritizing nothing over being. The fulcrum to the dialectical totality interpretation that Brown formalizes is total inclusiveness. This is something that I'd be interested in discussing further with relations to dialetheism. And the reason being transitions into nothing is because being contains everything in the most complete way. This dialectical totality affirms contradiction as the most inclusive relation possible, reifying the good infinite. The reason why the good infinite is truly limitless is not because it succeeds at divorcing itself from the finite, but because by including the genuinely finite, there is no other position that could possibly stand against it in exterior contrast. It includes the finite as an exterior, which is and is not an exterior. In short, dialectical totality affirms that since contradiction always includes the other, to be other than the relation that includes a positive and negative together is already included within it. Therein, the logic generates a concept of identity from recognition that the negativity of essence is at the same time the being of essence. Essence is an identity relation, for as that which being is not, essence reveals what being is, via apophatic alterity. This movement against being takes the form of A is A. The immediacy of being is reflected into itself. The subject is only understood to be identical with itself if it posits the difference alongside the identity of itself in the predicate position. A is equal to itself because it does not require anything other than itself. Yet the form that A must take as the confirmation of its own identity requires reflection, which requires absolute difference. Thus, identity self-subsists, but also depends on its own negativity. Difference is more comprehensive than identity because it contains a form of identity, and the identity of the negation dualizing A and non-A. To me, this reads as a dialetheist reading where, contra those like priest, form, and content aren't separated. Hegel's actuality, moving to that, offers the possibility as much about non-actuality as it is about actuality. So the third chapter, Hegel on possibility, articulates a twofold conception of possibility: a positive side, where that which is possible can become actual, and a negative side, where something can remain merely possible as a possibility not to be. Brown argues that, quote, the negative side of possibility, that which is possible can also not be, plays a significant role in Hegel's modal argument, and the actualization of possibility leads to a productive contradiction. For since this contradiction can't be sustained, Hegel's modal reality takes on a developmental structure in which actuality expands to include the concrete existence of the totality of possibility. The argument that, quote, actuality expands to include the totality of possibility is thus the basis of his one world vision of modality, unquote. And we get this tripartite model by which thought attempts to realize the actuality of the possible itself. So we have formal contingency. Actuality includes the opposite through a strategy of indifference. This is the negative side of possibility, the what could have been. This actual that has an expression in its opposite, i.e. that what could have been includes its counterfactual. Then we have real or conditional actualization, where actuality eventually realizes itself by making use of conditions that are both actuality and possibility at the same time. And due to the law of non-contradiction, actuality is able to sustain both contraries of possibility. And, quote, because what is actual is possible, actuality can not only be one side or the other of the possible, but must come to form itself as a totality of possibility, unquote. And then we have absolute actuality, which explores the modal ramifications of substance, which is simultaneously actuality and possibility, or substance as an actuality that is explicitly both sides of possibility together, i.e. both this particular and its universal instantiation. This is related to Hegel's relation of substantiality, the relation of absolute conversion between actuality and possibility as actuosity. What is actualized is, quote, the absolute conversion of actuality and possibility into each other, an actuality that completely sustains itself in its possibility, but only by becoming the other of itself, unquote. All three models fail to completely present an actuality of the possible itself, but they do succeed in partially expressing the inherent contradictions riddling modal actuality. For Brown, Hegel's groundbreaking and controversial conclusion about modality is that actuality must be able to express both sides of possibility at once. Despite the actuality of both sides of possibility leading to an unresolvable modal paradox at first glance, the conflicting sides of possibility stand together through the division of what is and what could have been. Now, formal actuality is the starting point of modal reality in analogous fashion to how being is the presuppositionless and indeterminate foundation for the development of determinate meaning. Reality requires the existence of unactualized possibilities as part of the constitution of what makes it true, actuality. And more concisely, possibility functions as a reflection of actuality itself. Brown's Hegel here recalls Aristotle's theta of the metaphysics, where actuality is conceptually prior and more primary than the possible. Brown's view is that in beginning his modal analysis with actuality, possibility is, for Hegel, the in itself and the reflection of actuality. And unlike his predecessors who detemporalize the in itself, Hegel grounds and temporalizes the in itself by emphasizing thought, which actualizes both negative and positive sides of possibility at once as one actuality. Accordingly, thought does the heavy ontological lifting, raising the status of unactualized possibility to the status of actuality. I would like to talk about time and its relation with the thought event here and what thinking is doing perhaps later. Then we also have the notion of possibility as a degree of quantity, which we sort of talked about in the first presentation. Possibilities are at first dispersed in others and are actualized through conditions. Now, contra Aristotle's modal priority of eternal substances, Hegel offers a dialectical co-primacy between actuality and possibility, where both are in different respects prior to the other, and unactualized possibilities and the status of actuality are ontologically equal. So for Brown, if we're to speak in terms of modal priority for Hegel, or from the terms of world separation, we can conclude that Hegel offers a one-world metaphysical system that's based on immanent layers of world-like composites rather than transcendent worlds beyond this one. And this is poised against traditional non-dialectical accounts of modality, like Leibniz's logical conception of the nature of substance. And these traditional non-dialectical accounts of modality avoid this contradiction by lowering the ontological status of unactualized possibility to non-actuality, while categorically separating actuality and possibility from each other. Like thought, Hegel's conception of substance as an actuality explicitly assumes both sides of possibility, i.e. this particular goat and the universal instantiation of a goat. Possibilities necessarily exist as part of substance, but because of the movement inherent to inclusive necessity, Hegel's notion of unactualized possibility is not relegated to some static category, but mobilized as actuality and possibility become unified. So the traditional reading of the dialectic between absolute necessity and contingency affirms that Hegel ultimately recognizes the concept of contingency as a necessary element of a system. Brown pushes for a more radical conclusion that draws us from the path from being to nothingness's transition to contradiction, and from this to Hegel's modal argument. By absolute necessity, Hegel proposes a reasoning of why things cannot be otherwise because everything has already been included in absolute contingency. For Brown, the traditional reading, as we've already seen, aligns the contingency of necessity, and it solely emphasizes the necessity of contingency, prioritizing necessity and reading contingency as just one of the other necessary concepts of the logic. So the traditional reading comes to be overwrought and in turn blinded by the mutual transitional movement from contingency to necessity and vice versa. Brown argues that recognizing that this mutual transition complements the incomplete traditional readings, Brown argues that recognizing that this mutual transition complements the incomplete traditional readings, as contingency is not only necessary in Hegel's system, but also necessity is contingent, is critical. And there's good reason, I think, to endorse this. Espousing the traditional renderings would imply that necessity is more primary than contingency, as all concepts are of necessity and come from necessary developments, with contingency just playing a marginal role as one of those multiplicitous necessary concepts. With Brown's reading, we get something that's really robustly dialectical, as absolute necessity turns out to be absolute contingency, applicable to Hegel's conception of substance, and similarly applicable to the thematic of the doctrine of essence, explaining the modality between how something is both universal and individual at once. The inclusive nature of contradiction is captured in the modal theory that is prioritized in the Actuality chapter, where we include the negative, non-A, alongside the positive, the A of absolute necessity, because A is non-A, anticipates every possible permutation in every which way of A. So what makes something absolutely necessary is not solely the inclusive nature of A and non-A, but its mediating force, making actuality explicit as a unity of itself and possibility or contingency. So absolute necessity determines itself as contingency, as absolute necessity operates over actuality, just as contingency does. Formal possibility is not necessity and cannot transition into necessity. It is indifferent to both the distinction and identity of A and non-A, and the identity, i.e. contingency, accounts for the difference and necessity for identity. So we ought not to reduce absolute possibility to formal possibility. Then we have the second half of the book, which is chapters 4 through 6, which articulates the theory of modal optimism. We've already heard a decent bit about this in the first presentation. This posits that despite the surface of the actual world expands/contracts by degrees of possibility, there's an underlying ontological commitment to an immanent but infinite totality of the possible. Brown infers that infinite sets of infinite possibilities exist in this actual world. This is only partially alluded to in the Logic's Actuality chapter, and this is probably the more inventive section, I would say, of the book. The proposed reading has a theory of modal transitivity, with necessity amplifying possibility rather than restricting it. We've got this Hegel's productive biconditional entailment that argues that certain types of determinate necessity, while restricting possibility in a superficial sense, also amplify what is immediately actual towards greater amounts and varieties of possibility. So we've got two versions of modal transitivity. One is a necessity access model, where necessity amplifies possibility by bringing access to otherwise inaccessible possibilities that are buried on the surface of the actual world. And then the necessity production model, where necessity amplifies possibility by producing new possibilities that would not have otherwise been. Hegel endorses a real determinate modal dialectic from possibility to necessity, where the possibilities of something are at first dispersed in others and can be actualized only through conditions which require structures of determinate necessity within the environment of the real world. In turn, all possibilities necessarily exist, but not all possibilities are necessarily actual. Most possibilities remain embedded in conditions and require necessity to bring them into actuality. According to this conception, those unicorns that we spoke of earlier, monsters, worlds with inverse gravity, all exist, but their existence doesn't necessitate their actualization. Rather, conceptual existence is determinately dialectical, wherein actuality and possibility posit one another and are bound together. So the unicorn, in order to be conceptually meaningful, can't be self-subsisting, but remains in terms of possibility contra the horse, which is actual. Because something can be identical only with itself, i.e. A equals A, it cannot be both itself and the opposite of itself, formally speaking. For Hegel, something's possibilities are already contained in the context of other events, conditions, qualities. The immediate actuality of what something is not, where actualization happens through contraries and from a disposition that is inclusive in scope rather than exclusive. Critically, the mediated indirect solution affirms the existence of unactualized possibility, ratifying the divergence of incompossibility as a modal fabric of life. Hegel's theory of modal transitivity, according to Brown, is particularly applicable to the domain of aesthetics via the free play of necessity and possibility, where spirit shines through the various mediums of the sensuous. There's a lot of really interesting things about aesthetics here that we won't have time to get into, nor about Leibniz's transcendental world separation and Deleuze's conception of the virtual. I do think that there is one point of critique in a small sense, and perhaps I can be corrected on this. So it has to do with the actualization of actualities and the actualization of actualities out of actuality versus the actualization of actualities out of possibility. So I think that unlike people that emphasize alethic modality versus deontic modality like Brandom, I don't think Brown makes such a mistake that seeks doesn't repeat these mistakes, and in doing so seeks to express a suppressed form of contradiction that's inherent to the actuality of possibility. I think in taking up the so-called substitution interpretation, Brown gives us a compromise between the claim that Hegel avoids contradictions by radicalizing the principle of non-contradiction. I think those like Brandom have this notion that Hegel offers a radical stance of the principle of non-contradiction, where non-contradiction becomes recognized as an active principle of argumentation and individuation, rather than a merely passive axiom of basic reality. But and compared to, and I think this brings Brown to a somewhat dialetheist rendering, I also think that it's more effective than some dialetheist readings like Priests that claim that Hegel is a precursor to dialetheism, where syntactic contradiction brings to bear nothingness as the ontological foundation for everything, but form and content are seen as distinct. Brown's interpretation sees Hegel as committed to the primacy of contradictions over identity, and then in turn contradictions really exist. So on the one hand, Brown's interpretation complicates the direct existence of contradictions by claiming that contradictions necessarily withdraw from actualizations and cannot appear directly as existence. Contradictions in their withdrawal produce substitution concepts that stand in their place. The question is how this substitution brings to bear possibility. We have that tripartite model that illustrates how thoughts attempt to realize the actuality of the possible. But Brown implicitly theorizes, I think, or this is the point of critique that I am interested in discussing a bit, actualization out of possibility. So this reading emphasizes possibility over actuality a position that I think we could say Hegel can't hold because actuality is always prior to possibility, and possibilities are but moments in actuality. So the priority of actuality over possibility as the metaphysical makeup of actuality prohibits the idea of actualization out of possibilities. If Brown's actuality emerges out of possibilities, the actual had to presuppose its possibilities, i.e. possibilities had to be prior to actuality. So one might challenge that, even if we understand Brown's interpretation of actualization as producing a modal version of Hegel's arguments for real actuality, this still would not amount to actualization out of possibilities. Because for Hegel, real actuality emerges from conditions, as Brown also draws out, which are themselves actuals, but recognized by the conditional actuals as its own possibilities. There's a bit more that I'll say here because Brown outlines a really rigorous notion of possibility as a degree of quantity that, quote, possibilities are at first dispersed in others and are actualized through conditions, unquote. And this presentation of Hegel's modal priority offers that co-primacy between actuality and possibility, where both are in different respects prior to the other. Moving from thought to substance, we have this conception of substance as an actuality that implicitly assumes both sides of possibility, i.e. this particular rose and the universal instantiation of rose, not to repeat the goat example, it works there too. It follows then interpreting Brown that possibilities necessarily exist as part of substance, but because of the movement inherent to inclusive necessity with the concrete universal, Hegel's notion of unactualized possibility is not relegated to some static category, but mobile, where an actuality and possibility become unified. So we have this point, this really important point that Brown makes, which I think is very critical for all scholarship here to come. The traditional reading of Hegel's dialectic between absolute necessity and contingency affirms that Hegel ultimately recognizes the concept of contingency as a necessary element of his system. And we are given a much more radical conclusion that draws from the being to nothingness transition to contradiction, from this to the modal argument, where absolute necessity proposing a reasoning of why things cannot be otherwise, because everything has already been included in absolute contingency. The inclusive nature of contradiction captured in the modal theory of the Actuality chapter per Brown, wherein to include the negative non-A alongside the positive A is of absolute necessity because A is non-A and anticipates every possible permutation in every which way of A. But here I present the question: how could it be the case that thought actualizes possibilities if actuality is prior to possibility? To actualize possibilities inevitably presupposes the prior presence of possibility to actuality. That is, there must at least be a possibility before being actual that thought actualizes it. Brown's program here seems more Aristotelian than Hegel, I would pose. It's something that I haven't totally justified, but to the last two sentences, I think that there's this reading, a more Aristotelian reading perhaps, that actuality is prior to potentialities, but also that actuality is always actualized potentialities. And insofar as Hegel's modal treatment, formal, real, absolute, is concerned, there's this argument for the priority of actuality over possibility. So I would say, in wrapping up, that there's this wager that I would propose whether we could say Hegel doesn't use the term actualization and actualization of possibility because there is no such thing for Hegel. Actuality simply determines itself through its negativity, i.e. possibility, and that this is the self-determining lifeblood from which its movement unspools. But this is a small query, one that I can likely be corrected on. Thank you so much for this opportunity and for this wonderful contribution, Nahum.
Thanks.
Nahum, would you like to respond before we open for general discussion?
Sure. I have to think more about the point you're making, and the criticism at the end. Thank you so much. That was great. It's so very detailed, and yeah, you're really you're really getting to so much there in what you're saying, and you're explaining it so well. And I'm not sure I fully follow the question you're asking at the end, and I think I'd have to think about it more. And I know you wrote it out to me yesterday, and I just haven't been able to digest it fully, and I didn't digest it fully as I heard it. But it sounded like you were talking about. Well, one point you're making is can we talk about actualization in Hegel? And I've made a big deal of doing that, right? In the third chapter, I talk a lot about the actualization of the possible itself. That's kind of the key. That's the key issue, you could say. And so maybe I've interpreted differently from how it goes in the chapter, or maybe that it'll lead to a slightly different reading if you don't go along with me and say there's an actualization of the possible. It's just actuality, right? That's one point I heard from you, and that may lead to a slightly different reading. I haven't thought that through further. And then it seemed like you were also talking about an issue about priority of the actual and the possible, and I didn't fully understand that. So maybe you could spell it out to me more, but I do have a few other things that I'd like to say. And there are a few other kind of questions that you brought up. One is that with this contrast between these readings of the end of the chapter, contingency, the traditional reading being that contingency is one of the necessary categories of the logic. I don't mean my other idea here to be mutually exclusive with that traditional point. I do think that traditional point is a great insight, and so I've come around more, I think, in my thinking over the years to the basic thesis that there is real necessity to the categories of the logic. And so I would put it slightly differently, and I may have written that differently in the book. I don't know, I'd have to go back and check. But so that's just a sort of a small qualification, but it has big consequences in a way. I hope that the alternative point that I'm making there about necessity and contingency can be understood alongside that very powerful traditional idea, that sort of classic idea at this point, that contingency is a necessary category of the logic. You also bring up the question of dialetheism, and so I think that's interesting, especially for this group, and like Greg's book also really addresses this in a lot of ways. And it might be good to think about how, I mean, we have Greg here, and you've worked so much on this rational dialetheism as you talk about it in your book. I think that I'm working on contradiction in somewhat of a similar way as Greg is. I definitely take a lot from Graham Priest and think his work is excellent, but I do think there's a real criticism to address in Priest, as you've brought out, Akin, in your maybe you didn't say it fully in the written in the version you just read, but in the written version you sent to me, Priest has a reading of Hegel which formalizes which formalizes dialectics, and there's a kind of an inherent problem there, and it's it comes up in the beginning of the logic, where Hegel says that form and content can't be separated. And so the formalizing of even a logic that's going to be dialectic, that's going to have contradiction, is problematic. That we'll need to think this as a unity of form and content together. And so I would say that Greg and I really connect on that point. I do feel, and this is maybe also to answer more of your question, that I'm offering in the second chapter a mitigated view of dialetheism in Hegel. Mitigated in the sense that I'm trying to present it as there is an inability for contradiction to appear in a certain important sense, but that it also is that through contradiction there is a litany of production of concepts which express contradiction, but not fully. And so contradiction has this kind of withdrawal to it, but it is also generating concepts that for non-dialectical thinking would seem to be non-contradictory, like the actualization of the possible. And so the way that I've read Hegel is that on the chapter of actuality is that there's this fundamental contradiction in the formal section at the beginning, and modal concepts are produced from that contradiction, which both express the contradiction, but also mitigate it so that it has meaning. I do go along with the idea that in a fundamental sense, we can't fully think contradiction. So is Hegel saying that we can? That would be a more robust sense of dialetheism, maybe. And I do think that I have a lighter sense of it.
May I respond briefly?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I mean, there's so much to talk about with the dialetheism stuff. Since Gregory is here, perhaps some of that can be saved for the bit where we have a group discussion. So as far as the clarification regarding what my point of inquiry, so you make the case that formal actuality is the starting point of modal reality in analogous fashion to how being is a presuppositionless, indeterminate foundation for the development of determinate reading. You also state that reality, it requires the existence of unactualized possibilities, and that's part of the constitution of what makes it true, and that possibility functions as a reflection of actuality itself. And you even bring up, I think, Aristotle, where actuality, the theta of the metaphysics, where actuality is conceptually prior and then more primary than the possible. And then and I think if I understand you correctly, that your argument is that beginning his modal analysis with actuality, possibility is for Hegel the in itself and the reflection of actuality. And that unlike his predecessors, well, let's just end that bit there. So I don't know if my line of inquiry here is really correct in saying that your interpretation is is more Aristotelian than Hegel. That's a big claim that would need justification. But the question is, hey, there seems to be a thinking of Hegel's account where the relation of actuality to possibility brings the question, how could it be the case that thought actualizes possibilities if actuality is prior to possibilities? Because to actualize possibilities seems to me to inevitably presuppose the prior presence of possibility to actuality. That is, there must be at least a possibility before being actual that thought actualizes it. And it seems to me that Aristotle definitely thinks this, because for him, actuality is prior to potentialities, but somehow he also argues that actuality is always actualities and potentialities. People who work on Aristotle or work in Aristotelian spirit, I think Agamben even makes such a case. And they identify this as an ambiguity, but a productive ambiguity. And putting aside what Aristotelians or Agamben would do with this problem, it seems like an issue for Hegel, because in his modal treatment, the formal, real, absolute, he consistently argues for the priority of actuality over possibility. And that's why one could say, the term actualization of possibility doesn't even come up because actuality simply determines itself through its negativity, which is possibility. And if you like, it is self-determining. The actual actualizes itself. I mean, that might sound like a tautology, but there's no such thing as a thought like in Leibniz that possibilities are concealed potentialities of the actuals, and that the only thing for Hegel an actual does is to manifest itself, and its manifestation is its actualization. But that was, I don't know if that was clearer.
I think I'm grasping it better now that you say it again, but maybe not fully, and so we can just keep working on this. Hegel begins the formal section of the chapter with formal actuality. And he says that possibility is the in itself of this actuality, but it's also the totality of form. And then as we turn the pages to to real modality, he begins again with real actuality, and then we get real possibility, and we get absolute actuality as the starting concept. I don't know what to make of that. I mean, some people will say that there is this Aristotelian tendency. Then he's starting with the concept of actuality and seeing possibility as a kind of dependency, and in itself, it is on the one hand just what the actual is supposed. So the possible is the actual reflected into itself. It's only that. And so there's actually not much room for the possible as a separated concept. And yet also it's the opposite of the actual. So the conclusion I draw in a number of places in explicating Hegel is that even though he started with the actual, and the possible is framed in terms of being an in itself of the actual, ultimately, he ends up with a transitional relationship between actuality and possibility, and you said that quite well in when you read. So there's kind of a co-primacy. In some ways, the actual maybe is more primary than the possible, and vice versa. I haven't thought really more about sort of this complication you mentioned. It sounds like you're asking, is there a way in which the possible is given as prior still, and that doesn't quite make sense? And then, in terms of actualization, right? So we have an actualization, but we had to have something there kind of prior as a possible. Can I put the conversation back to you?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is some. I guess your remarks clarify the interpretation. I mean, we have to. It seems there has to be some type of interpretation here, and the one that you just gave, it's certainly robustly defended in the text, and I don't have much to say beyond my inquiry is just at one point thinking of how actuality is what comes prior to actuality as an actuality versus a potentiality. You've given the answer that I think interpretively makes sense. The question is just there's perhaps another interpretation that where one could stake that it's not the case. But I think insofar as there's some dialetheism, the weaker form of dialetheism you mentioned, the defense that you just gave seems to be more robustly in that vein, and for that reason I quite like it. So that's, yeah.
I'll just butt in and say something regarding all of this. I think it's crucial to sort of keep in mind the bounds of the entire framework of all of the categories and developments that come up in actuality. Not only do they fall within the logic of essence, but they all, in a way, involve substance, not subject. They all involve modality, which could be said to involve what Hegel will call manifestation, where possibility, actuality, necessity, and they're formal, they're real, they're absolute determinations, all really involve form determinations of the same content, which is given from the outset. And that is the key to what distinguishes substance from subject. That substance always just manifests what it already is. And in none of its exertions of its power in a sense to bring itself forward and is in any way really giving itself new determination. And this is exhibited in all of the, let's say, transformations of the nodal categories, which will allow someone like Kant to say that really, they have absolutely nothing to do with the determination of an object or add anything to the determination of an object. He will pose it in purely, let's say, cognitive or subjective terms, in terms of different kinds of relationships to the faculties of cognition. But in and of themselves, I think Hegel's discussion sort of makes clear we're here dealing with things that are bound up within this entire framework of substance, which is that which, in a sense, manifests what it is without in any way giving itself new determination, and is that which, in a sense, rests upon itself. It actualizes itself. But actualization, or one might say in Aristotelian terms, the realization of potential, is completely different from self-determination and freedom, and what characterizes subjectivity. And one might even say what characterizes anything that falls outside the domains of a kind of external necessitation. So that involves life, that involves conduct, that involves thinking proper, that involves beauty. So that it's not correct to talk about thought actualizing anything or thought having potential. At least if we're thinking about thought as being autonomous. And I think it's crucial to see what this would signify with regard to the applicability of the modal categories. They reign supreme in early modern philosophy up through Kant. And I think it's easy to see why they do. Because when you think of objectivity as being determined by some underlying epistemological foundation, that means that which is knowable is automatically subject to necessitation, and necessitation from without, namely from these cognitive faculties. And it's a necessitation of such a character that it pertains to transformations that have nothing to do with the identity of that which is subject to them. Because remember, the determination of what can be known, to the extent that it is put in the object by knowing, is something that applies to all objects equally, irrespective of what they are. So that in a way, the bonds of this externally determined objectivity take the form of laws, a lawful ordering, which applies equally to every object, no matter what it is. And when we're talking about causality, we're talking about precisely that kind of relationship that is fundamentally blind. So I think it's interesting to keep that in mind, that these categories, which early modern philosophy up through Kant take to be definitive of what is thinkable and knowable, and thereby prevent reason from grasping anything truly free and subjective, including anything alive, anything beautiful, are categories from which we are liberated, and which in a sense point to the liberation of thought from confinement to them through the way in which they subvert themselves in the transition from the discussion of actuality to that of the concept. And I think it's crucial to see that all of the terms of the concept, universality, particularity, individuality, are not to be found in any of these relationships and cannot be found, but are located within a completely different domain, which does not involve the realization of potentials, does not involve actualization, does not involve contingency or necessity. I think it's important to see how these terms apply within the framework of substance, which I think Nahum it was important for you to point to it. I think it's interesting to look at how substance kind of bookends the modal categories in Hegel's development. We start with the absolute. He's not yet talking in terms of possibility, actuality, necessity, right? He speaks about attribute and mode. But that itself gives us an actuality that has possibility, has, in a sense, the power to, in a sense, bring into reality what could be said to be implicit in it, without in any way giving itself new determination, because it's just a manifestation of what's already there. And everything is spoken of in terms of a kind of identity. And then you work your way through absolute necessity, absolute possibility, absolute contingency, where in effect it is a kind of process. I think you're completely on the mark to think back to a similar type of process when you talk about the good infinite. You can also speak about the measure relations that take us from being into essence. I mean, the measureless infinite series here too, where in a sense, everything that is contingent is just as much necessitated, so that necessity is no longer merely relative, but becomes absolute because it encompasses everything that could be said to be a condition for itself. That, interestingly enough, is going to provide a transition to what Hegel will characterize in terms of the relation of essence and accident, of substance and accident, which itself will provide the basis for being able to speak about relations between substance, which can only take the form of a kind of blind causality, where you can't think of causal relations applying to different stages in a single substance. They can only pertain to, in a way, aspects of the accidentality of a substance having an impact upon the accidentality of another substance. But I just want to put all of that before you. Obviously, a great big topic and theme, but I think it's of decisive importance in how we contextualize all of this and recognize it's very different in Hegel's discussion from anyone else.
Thank you, Richard. That's wonderful. Yeah, the contextualization is really helpful. And it's really hard to do in a way. And I think it takes someone who's worked for so long on the science of logic to be able to do that well. I think that's sort of a more mature vision of Hegel that is so hard also. We've done 2 hours. Do we had talked about having a conversation together, but things have gone a little long. What should
Would anyone like to make, who hasn't just spoken, make it a final remark, perhaps?
Well, maybe I'll say something and we can go 5 or 10 extra minutes if that's okay. And just some remarks and maybe also some questions back to Nahum. Yeah, thanks everybody for your wonderful questions and commentaries. Nahum, for your response. I just thought I would just note a couple things, make a couple comments since my name came up in the discussion. Yeah, so I'm really sympathetic with Nahum's reading of Contradiction, and in many personal conversations we've talked about the substitution account he gives. One thing that kind of comes up in my own thinking about this is that there's a kind of a contradiction that's a kind of a meta contradiction, if you will, that arises in thinking about the substitutionary character of contradiction. Because on the one hand, the contradiction is there, right? As Nahum points out, it's productive, and it is suppressed. That is to say, it's also negated, right? So the contradiction is, and it's not. And this is, in a way, the kind of meta-contradictory situation we find ourselves in, that the contradiction itself is contradictory.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, in a way, its consistency, that it is itself. I think that's also clear when Nahum talks about the absolute as A and not A is contradictory, that's true. But there's another way in which it isn't. namely that when it is thought as absolute, there's nothing outside of it. And so in the total exhaustion, there's nothing to which it can stand in contrast. There's nothing that can negate it. And in this way, it stands by itself. And what stands by itself doesn't stand in contradiction to anything. So there is a way in which it's both contradictory and it's not. And I think for me, that's what I would, maybe not the final word, but I think that inevitably one finds oneself in these kind of contradiction itself is contradictory. And this is something I think that one needs to supplement the story with. But this is where my thinking is right now on the question. But of course, even the whole question of contradiction, again, as Richard has pointed out, shows up within a set of categories endemic to logic of reflection, in essence, which haven't yet arisen to the status of the concept. So there's some qualifications that have to be made when we're thinking about the totality in these terms. I just as a general question, this is, Nahum doesn't need to answer it now, but something that I've been thinking about in connection with his work on possibility is the ontological argument in Hegel's Science of Logic. Everyone may remember that Hegel will talk about the transition from concept to objectivity as this moment of the ontological, or what was understood as the ontological concept, that the concept is self-objectifying. And I'm thinking out loud about whether and to what extent we can employ categories like a possibility, actuality, necessity to think about the role of this so-called argument in Hegel's logic. The strange thing about the ontological argument is that you have a concept, right? That in virtue of, you have a possibility, in virtue of what it is, it must be. The concept, in virtue of what the concept is, must be, right? What is rational must be, the concept must be, right? So clearly, whatever kind of ontological argument is going on there in Hegel involves some kind of self-realizing possibility or self-realizing actuality. I don't know if it's already problematic to even speak in those terms, as Richard has indicated, but just as a lingering question that I have for myself to think about, also just to Nahum. I don't think that you talk much about the ontological argument in the book, but it's just a lingering question of mine. And of course, Ekin also mentioned something about temporality, which we didn't have a chance to get to. I would also just be curious for the future, what exactly your concern was there, or what your thoughts were about temporality, because you kind of mentioned them briefly, but then maybe didn't have time to go into detail about that. The reason that I mention it is that it's unclear that in the logic, time is present at all. So on my reading, there's just, the logic is, maybe I've been accused of being a Platonist here, which I'm happy to be accused of that there's just no time in logic at all. So that's my view, is there's no time. Being is being, not yesterday or now or tomorrow, but being is being without qualification or reference to time. So I'm actually wondering how the temporality comment kind of fits in, or where maybe you were kind of going with that, but that's quite a bit. Yeah, sorry, thanks. Maybe that was too much, but I don't know, Nahum or Ekin, you guys want to say anything about those comments?
Very briefly, I will just say I am also, Nutso as my instructor, as my mentor, as this way of reading the logic that perhaps those of you who are familiar with her work will recognize, that there is thinking without a subject. And for her, time is also not going on. And so I'm pretty curious now, what you think of this.
What I think of this about time.
And thinking, because if thinking plays a role and thinking takes place in time, what you have to say about that bit too? Is there thinking that takes place in time?
Time is conspicuously missing from the categories of the logic, and that's been an open question to me. And I think Greg is giving us some ideas of why it might be missing. It's, but it comes up also as a question because these modal, the modal chapter is so close to time. I mean, modality is like one spot over from the temporal concepts, I would say. And so it brings up the question, you know, why is there no concept? Why is there no chapter on time? So, Greg, I think you give an interesting and plausible reason for that. It does seem like, in a sense, time would be important for modality, and in other aspects of Hegel's work and in the phenomenology, it's important. Time comes right up in the beginning of the phenomenology with the now.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, this is a question that is far beyond the scope of the panel. Of course, it's just something that Ekin had pointed out in passing. I mean, I think there is a distinction between. This is a distinction that I'm interested in drawing. I don't know if this is standard or not, but there's a thinking that the philosopher does, the thinking about the categories of the logic. And my thinking about the categories involves reference to a subject who arguably is in time. Here I am in my office, and here I am talking to you now and thinking about being, nothing, becoming, possibility, actuality, necessity, etc. And then there's the categories that proceed and develop themselves without my noticing them. And you can think about this distinction whereby you could have categories undergoing self-development without anyone noticing that they're undergoing self-development. And then you could have a notion of thinking that's temporal. This is the sense of the real. There's a real thinker. And then there's a kind of logical thinking that's a self-thinking thought without a temporal subject. I tend to make a distinction there, and that there's two senses of subjectivity happening in. There's a temporal subject that's thinking, and there's a non-temporal self-thinking thought that's happening in logic. That may or may not be thought by a thinker, a real thinker. But this is just, yeah. So then there would be the logic that is, and then there is the logic that becomes a science in the history of, say, human thinking. And then these wouldn't necessarily be the same. Logic needs to become science. It needs to be known by us. But I don't know, this is going too far afield from the topic at hand. I didn't mean to get us distracted. My apologies. Oh, and I just want to maybe, since we're not finishing yet and we're just going over, if anyone who has to just leave, you can, I'm very sympathetic with this idea that we have a kind of that there is arguably a kind of dialectism in Hegel that treats form and content as inseparable. So I think a little bit of nuance in this subject is helpful. There's different kinds of dialectisms, different kinds of dialectic readings of Hegel. And there's no need for us to commit ourselves, if we do read Hegel dialectically, to commit ourselves to a formal or merely syntactical understanding of it. So there's just no reason to do that. So I think what we're seeing in some of the recent literature is a diversification of these dialectic readings of Hegel. So it's not just is he or is he not, but there's also the question of what kind of, both and of course, but what kind of dialectics are we dealing with here? So that's a different question altogether.
A kind of interesting footnote in a way to the issue of whether we can locate any temporality in the thought determinations and determinings in logic is, you know, to think of the kind of perplexities and paradoxes that skeptics point to when they try to show how you can't really make any sense of the relation of cause and effects, for example. And I think you could also say potentiality and actuality and their relationship, if you think of them in being in any kind of temporal separation. The cause can't be a cause if you think of the effect as being something that is at a different point in time. And on the other hand, of course, you may also want to think about, well, what are you talking about when you talk about time? And I think Hegel's account in the philosophy of nature, I think in a very meaningful way, points out how time itself is parasitic upon space. It's the way in which space in its totality is external to itself from one moment to the next. And I think those kind of insights help understanding how the logical development has nothing temporal about it. Can't have anything temporal about it. Unless one confuses it with the thinking of categories by an actual living subject, such as you and me. And that's different. That's a different kind of subject matter.
Well, Nahum, do you have any final words before we've gone over any final words, any final comments before we close it up?
I'd just like to thank you all. I'd like to thank you for hosting this and for presenting. I think this was great. It helped me a lot. I learned a lot from it and kind of rethink some of the ideas in my book. And I'm really grateful to both of you for presenting and for thinking with me about this stuff. It means a lot to me. So yeah, thanks.
And I'd just like to thank
you.
all of the participants for the hard work and deep thinking they provided. And I just want to alert our worldwide audience to check the website of the Society for Systematic Philosophy for notices of future events, which I hope you will attend. Take care.
Okay, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Okay, well, great.